No reason to believe they were like packages. Apparently, I could have gotten a drink and a breakfast for $5.
There you go. I smell a class action lawsuit.
Bummer.
Yeah.
How did I not know? Well, you know, I don't know. Maybe he's just trying to streamline things. We'll have to see as he builds up.
I'm all for this, though. I mean, all seriousness, though. I mean, and we've talked a lot about this. The idea that when you get into this sort of vortex of discounts, it's hard to pull yourself out of it, just as Bed Bath & Beyond. And sometimes you just have to hold the ground and say, look, the price is the price. It doesn't mean that there can't be promotions from time to time, but if you make that perpetual, you'll never get out from under it.
Don't mess with my Bed Bath & Beyond coupons.
Don't forget.
I have to break it to you. Your Bed Bath & Beyond coupons are zero. Squadouche.
Those aren't going to work.
Yeah.
But you know, you can actually buy stuff, right? And then you're like, oh, I forgot my coupons. And then come back and then they apply them. Like, it was crazy.
Isn't that part of the problem? Like,
I wonder why they're not around anymore.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Hey, guys, the last thing I'll say about Starbucks and Brian Niccol, don't forget Brian Niccol was the guy who brought the Doritos Locos Taco to Taco Bell.
Yes.
So we'll see what he does in terms of menu innovation.
What's your point?
At Starbucks.
Yeah, do we like that?
What are you saying? You want a Doritos
Locos
Locos latte?
Yeah,
Is that what you're
that's what I'm
pushing for?
Half,
Oh.
There's no way Tim Senevic would ever let that pass.
Frito-Lay.
That square jaw of his. So.
I guess we got to go.
It is, right? It's a good one. All right, that's a wrap. Our cross-platform.
Aspire to be Tim Senevic.
It's like Superman, right? Clark Kent.
Why are you
What are we
covering
talking about here?
What are you doing?
All right, radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals. That's the Monday edition, our cross-platform. We will see you again, same time, same place tomorrow, guys.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
It is Bloomberg Business Week. It's a bird.
It's a plane.
It's a plane.
It's Superman.
You saw what I did there.
Did.
Kinda. Okay, well, SpaceX stunned the world during its Starship rocket test over the weekend. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't a plane. It was catching a booster in midair. Look at this on the screen right now for those watching on YouTube. It doesn't look real. This after it came back from space. It landed the rest of the rocket in the ocean after a plunge through Earth's atmosphere. If your X account is anything like mine, which is, yes, controlled by Elon Musk, to be fair, then your feed just over the weekend was full of videos showing this, Carol.
It's insane. It's insane. Lauren Grush is Bloomberg News space reporter, also the author of The Six, The Untold Story of America's First Women Astronauts. She joins us from Austin, Texas. Lauren, this is insane. You follow this world to see this. It's just crazy. Put it in context, how wild it is.
Yeah, I think, you know, as a reporter who covers SpaceX for, you know, many years, we're all kind of used to them kind of pushing the envelope and really pulling off these amazing feats of engineering. But I have to say, you know, this really took things up a notch. I think there was a lot of skepticism going into this about whether or not it would be successful, because, I mean, you look at it and it does look surreal, right? You know, it's catching this massive booster in midair using these grid fins that are so small in comparison to the booster itself. And I think when they first had talked about it, I was definitely very curious to see how it would play out, but it worked exactly as designed. And so, you know, you have to hand it to them. It was a pretty spectacular feat.
Yeah, really cool stuff. But why do they explain why they tested this, why they have to do this? Because anyone familiar with the way that SpaceX lands boosters, at least for other rockets, they do this on barges. They can land kind of anywhere. Why do they need to catch this in midair?
Yeah, so for them, I think it was just more about how it was designed, and it was easier for them not to put landing legs on the booster. So for the Falcon 9, they have landing legs that deploy, and that allows them to land that way. But with this, the idea is that, you know, the launch tower will catch these boosters, lower them down to the launch mount. So they're basically back where they started. They refuel them, put a new ship on top, and then, you know, launch it again. And so that's kind of the idea behind this, is to be rapidly reusable and fully reusable, which is supposed to, you know, allow them to move much more quickly and to bring down the launch costs. If you remember, you know, Falcon 9s are technically reusable, but they're only partly reusable because their upper stages or top portions don't return to Earth. So this would be a bit of a game changer if they can get the full thing to be reused and then turn around, super quickly.
Okay, so now Elon can go to Mars. Well, not yet.
I don't know if he's in
but
line.
not so
I think he's
simple.
like,
But this is part of the process, right? Or this is part of his grand scheme.
Yeah, this was definitely a milestone that they really needed to achieve in order to get to that ultimate goal, right? Because one of the main things that Starship is going to have to do is refuel in orbit. So essentially, they'll have to launch Starship to orbit and then launch a bunch more times back to back, sending tankers to that Starship to fuel it up. And that's going to require, it could be dozens of launches, up to a dozen or so. We still don't know the exact number. And that's just to reach the moon, to have enough fuel to reach the moon. So they're going to have to be able to launch back to back in a really relatively short time frame. And so being able to return the booster, fill it up quickly, and then launch it again quickly, that's going to be essential in order for pulling off these deep space missions.
Can't even get my head around that.
so explain how that works. I mean, we've
Yeah.
all seen video of, well, we all spend our time watching videos on YouTube of air-to-air refueling, like I do, and I know my dad
It's
does.
for
right?
work. It's
Yeah.
for work.
At least
Or
when
other.
it comes to airplanes. How would this work for these boosters, Lauren?
The refueling aspect.
Yeah, the
of it, you
refueling
mean.
part of this.
Yeah, so let's take the moon, for example. So NASA has contracted SpaceX to send humans back to the moon with Starship, right? It's going to serve as this lunar lander. Well, first, what they'll do is they'll launch a depot is kind of the term they're using for it. Big storage tank of Starship into orbit. It's going to park in orbit. It'll be moving around the Earth, but it's parked. And then they'll launch, up to 10 or 12 additional Starships that will be filled with fuel, and they'll dock with that depot and transfer propellant into its tanks and
So
fill it up.
it's essentially creating a floating gas station for.
Yes, 100%. And then once they have deemed it full enough, they will launch the lander portion, Starship. That will dock with the tanker or the depot, get all the fuel it needs. So it's basically going to the gas station. They go fuel up, and then they'll go the rest of the way to the moon and hopefully have all of the propellant that they need to reach the moon.
And
So
Lauren, go ahead.
go ahead. Well, no, I'm just saying it sounds complicated, but if you think about it, it is pretty, it's just you don't take all the fuel you need with you to your deep, on your road trip. You have to fill up along the way. So it's kind of a similar.
So you got to
situation.
build the gas stations for
Yeah.
the boosters. But all this is in service to getting to Mars. So you used the moon as an example, but what Elon Musk wants to do is use this same model of sort of air-to-air fuel to eventually get to Mars, no?
Yes, absolutely. I think with Mars, it's certainly going to be a bit more complicated. He's been setting very aspirational goals lately. I think what was the latest one? They're going to send like 5 Starships to Mars by 2026. I always say, take his timelines with a
Yeah,
older
I think
size
Tesla
crystal
investors
ball.
know that, right? At this point.
Yeah, and to be fair, as monumental as this moment was for SpaceX, there's still a lot of road ahead in terms of development that they have to do. Not saying they can't do it. I'm just saying, be patient and don't always trust the timelines that they set for when they'll actually do it. So but this definitely was a hurdle that they needed to clear by far.
FAA, everybody in the government, okay with what Elon's up to here?
Well, yeah, I mean, if for those that don't know, this kind of the context of this mission was there was a bit of a battle brewing between Elon and SpaceX and the FAA. Originally, we had anticipated that this launch might not happen until late November. That's because SpaceX came out and said that was what they had been told by the FAA, that they weren't going to get their license for it. And for good reason, they had talked about more environmental concerns about this launch. Also, this launch was coming back, the booster was coming back to the launch pad. I think the FAA ultimately really wanted to be buttoned up with that return, because if it hadn't gotten caught as it had, it could have, severely damaged the launch pad and could have, resulted in debris in the surrounding area. So, there was definitely some tension leading up to this, but the FAA worked extra hard, and the process turned out to move more quickly than they had anticipated. And so I think ultimately, the FAA is trying to work with SpaceX here. And, I actually interviewed a member of the FAA's Commercial Space Office, and they talk about how 80% of their overtime is dedicated to SpaceX.
Oh, wow.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's still just kind of cool stuff. Lauren Grush, so glad you keep reporting on it for us all. Space reporter at Bloomberg News, joining us from Austin, Texas. Check her out on the Bloomberg and at Bloomberg.com.
It's 421 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. NVIDIA shares gained 2.4%, closing at the highest level on record, helping to push the S&P to another record close. It's 46th this year. We bring you the closing numbers each day here at Bloomberg. The S&P gained 45 points. It's a new high. NASDAQ gained 160 points. The Dow gained 201. The bond markets are closed today. Google has ordered 6 to 7 small modular nuclear reactors from Caro's Power. Financial Times reports that makes Google the first tech company to commission a new nuclear power plant to provide low-carbon electricity for its data centers. Shares of Oklo, which is a nuclear tech company, gained 1.5% in the post-market. And Tesla used humans to remotely control some capabilities of its Optimus robot prototypes at its recent We Robot showcase. That's according to people familiar with the matter. Sources tell Bloomberg employees stationed elsewhere oversaw many of the interactions between the humanoid Optimus machines and attendees of last week's showcase near Los Angeles. Tesla representatives did not immediately respond to requests for comment. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenovic.
All right, so appreciate it. Amy Morris there, in for Charlie Pellet. All right, I'm Carol Masser along with Tim Stenovic, live here on Bloomberg Business Week. Got to say, when we were reading in this morning, planning our broadcast, all 3 hours of it, we knew we wanted to get an update on what we needed to know when it comes to geopolitics. Still so much going on. We also wanted to get an update on how the U.S. election plays into it. It's something that we've asked some of our guests over the last couple of hours. One name at the top of our list that we knew we wanted to reach out to is Ed Price.
Here's why. He's a former British trade official. He's now a non-resident senior fellow at NYU. Also principal for geopolitical forecasting at the global intelligence and consulting firm Ergo. He's advised members of the European and British parliaments. And that's just a little bit of what he's done.
We always have fun. We get to dig into everything that's going on around the world. Ed, great to have you back with us. How are you?
Very well. Thanks for having me on. How are you?
Doing well, trying to keep up with stuff. And I kind of want to start with the elections because you did take a road trip. I think this is really cool. There's so much when you get in a car and drive around this country and really talk to people. You really get a good feeling of what's top of mind for them, and you get an idea of how they feel about candidates. And a lot of them have some strong positions. Tell us what you did over the summer.
Hey, thanks, Carol. Well, so I drove from New York to San Francisco via the northerly route, and then I drove back via the south, via Dallas, via New Orleans, and really just tried to stop as much as possible and just make conversation, right? Just stop someone and say, hey, how are you? By the way, what do you think about the election? What do you think about the economy?
And everyone greeted you with open arms, right?
I mean, right. So this is the interesting thing. We've heard this so many times. Jimmy Carville, it's the economy, stupid. It kind of is and it kind of isn't. And one of the things that I noticed most was that in any given generic conversation with anyone, really, after they'd said, oh, you know what, I really hate the other guy, right, the other candidate, they would then basically come up with a list of things that they wanted whoever it is that's president to do at home that were very similar. And so there's, you know, we always talk about polarization in this country. That is the case. But there's also this sort of bipartisan feeling that somehow, some way, the economy could be better. Now, that might mean that, you know, Harris is in trouble because it's in some ways her economy. But it's interesting to me that so many Americans said exactly the same thing.
Yeah, it's interesting that that's what you came away with.
But it's also so in stark contrast to so much data out there.
Right.
I mean, we spoke to Josh Reeves at Gusto earlier, and he's like, there's never been a better time to start a small business in the United States right now. Data point after data point, Carol, showing that for a lot of people, the economy is really good.
Exactly. And yet, Americans, there's a lot of Americans, as you know, Ed, that don't feel so good. I mean, based on your conversations, did you get a feel of who might ultimately win come November? We know it's a very close race. We see the polls. We are reminded of it daily or hourly. But did you get a good feel of which way it could go? And is it just based on the signs that were on people's lawns?
Oh, my goodness. Okay, listen, if presidents were elected via signage, Donald Trump would be the Roman emperor. Because I can tell you guys, in you know, hand on heart, I didn't see a single Harris sign in the Rust Belt. I didn't see a single Harris sign. No, seriously.
I know, I get it. I went around the country a lot in the last couple of months. One question I'll ask, though, is when were you doing this? What month? Because remember, July 21st is when Biden dropped out.
Yeah.
And the signs weren't around. The signs weren't around for a while.
So August, the whole month of August. It's a really good point about data. And of course, it might be that the missing signs just aren't there because either they haven't been printed or because people don't want to put them up. In which case, you might say that Richard Nixon's silent majority is going to go blue this year. But I've got to tell you, and I'll declare my bias. I'm voting this time. I'm voting against Donald Trump, so there's my bias. Me not seeing a single Harris sign and seeing ginormous Trump signs, you can't help but think, okay, this guy's going to win.
It's a good point. I think I've talked about this before, but I was in Colorado a few weeks ago, and it seemed like there were two things that I'll share. One is that there were a lot of local signs that were clearly proclaiming the way one person felt, like who the candidates were that they were voting for, that didn't necessarily, Ed, have a presidential sign with them. So it was like county commissioner, U.S. Senate, Congress, or rather Congress, House, not Senate. I saw a lot of House signs, and local state legislature signs, but not necessarily signs proclaiming president, which I thought really interesting, showing the way people were thinking down ballot.
That's super interesting too. And where I live, I'm in a red county, but I'm getting leaflets from both sides, both parties, and they've stopped putting their political party on them. It's just the name of the candidate, which I think is maybe another interesting data point.
I do also wonder, so much. There was an interesting Times story actually today, the New York Times, about, and it said the Trump voters who don't believe Trump. When the former president endorses violence and proposes using the government to attack his enemies, many of his supporters assumes it's just an act. I actually had a conversation with an individual over the past week when we were out on the West Coast. Same thing, said, I just think when the former president, Donald Trump, says things, he's just trying to kind of put people off, if you will, whether it's allies, whether it's political opponents, just kind of shake things up. But not that he's necessarily going to follow through with all these things. We know from his first administration, he does follow through with some things. But I wonder what you make of that argument or that thinking.
I wouldn't want to take the risk, frankly. As I say, I have a bias. I think he's a clear and present danger, to borrow from Tom Clancy, to the United States Constitution. That's my view. But the interesting thing I think about me turning up in hunting stores and 7-Elevens and not being a pollster and not really being a journalist is that very often I would speak to people who do support Trump, but then they'd give me like the second and third layer too. And one guy that comes to mind, he's running a hunting store in Oregon, where, by the way, there's a desert, which I didn't realize, but there he is running a hunting store.
It is.
Yeah, it's crazy. You should check it out. I was very surprised. But he sort of said to me, I'm voting Trump, but there are things I don't like about the guy, and I wouldn't talk like that in front of my kids. So, that's still there. And maybe I got to hear a bit more of that because, who am I? Nobody. I'm not a pollster.
Yeah, I guess the question is to what extent these folks show up. And also, based on where you were at, Oregon, a state like Oregon, not exactly a swing state right now. I mean, the Pennsylvania observation that you made were really interesting, and you did drive through a lot of swing states, certainly. But it's, as you know, we live in a world where the Electoral College, and I think Mark Gongloff, our columnist at Bloomberg Opinion who covers climate change, described as basically a football stadium full of people deciding the election.
Oof. Yes, that's probably true. So look, I'm back in New York State now. Probably some of those people aren't too far away in Pennsylvania. This was non-scientific, as I say, but if you just based it on visual evidence, conversational evidence, it feels like on the surface of things, Trump has this in the bag. Now, that said, there's always that chance that, as we know, in an election this close, that the other side pips through for some reason or other. But my feeling is that Trump could really get to the end here.
So, Ed, why did you write about this in the context of the silent majority in the Richard Nixon area? Why go back there?
Well, I think in part it's because I also have this side hustle teaching students, right? And I've been doing that for like 5 or 6 years now. Really enjoy it. But I've seen a change in the body politic, so to speak, of the student body. And it seems to me that there's at least one parallel with the Vietnam War, which is that there are moralistic imperatives in the minds of protesters to oppose U.S. foreign policy. Now, for me, that's false. That's not an equivalence that works because Vietnam was a as things turned out, an error, and the war that Israel's fighting was imposed on it. But, Richard Nixon was really trying to say in that speech that, look, you may not hear the people out there for Richard Nixon. He liked to speak about himself in the third person, but they're out there, they're just not protesting. And so the question was, are the people that aren't really out on the streets, are the people that aren't displaying big Trump signs thinking about voting for Harris? And I'm afraid to say I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like there's a fair amount of questions about, that and just kind of then what it means for the outcome. I am also curious, Ed, you're back from overseas. We talk a lot about whether it's U.S. allies, their concerns about the outcome of the election. What insight can you give us on that front?
I think, from my perspective, from European ties that I have, foreigners in the UK and Europe think this is probably an existential election. I'm heading over to Japan in a couple of months. I imagine they think the same thing. And a lot of this comes down to NATO, right? And whether or not, if Trump is re-elected, he goes and does, to your point, Carol, about whether he actually does the things he says, actually does go ahead and pull the US out of NATO in a meaningful way. And that's probably a segue at some point into the Ukrainian behavior on the battlefield. So foreigners right now, I think, are really scratching their heads about how exactly there could be such a bifurcated choice in the world of foreign policy between what we presume Harris will do and what Trump might. There's one caveat. They do seem to be joined at the hip in agreeing that Beijing is a problem. Mm-hmm. And it does seem whoever wins, as we know, trade policy will continue down a confrontational path.
So after living in the U.S. and traveling around the U.S., just in the last minute that we have with you, then we're going to come back and do some more. How do you explain to them that divide, that separation?
To Americans?
No, to people outside the U.S.
People outside?
Yeah.
I mean, look, I've been here 10 years now. I took the oath. I'm a U.S. citizen. I think that the longer you're here as someone who was born in Europe, the easier it is to understand what the American catchphrases mean. I'll be honest with you, 20 years ago, I would roll my eyes when I heard a monologue on freedom and being free, and I'd think, well, that's very silly. Now I'm less snotty, and I've realized that so many American traits are designed for living basically in the middle of nowhere. I think that's why Americans are friendly. I think that's why Americans share a lot more about themselves quite quickly. It's certainly why a lot of Americans carry guns. But the division itself, if I'm talking about that to friends at home, like I started this segment, is to say, I don't think it's that deep. And I think that when you really ask Americans, the average American, what do you want? They want a fair wage, they want their kids to do well, and they want some form of security, albeit they're now thinking about security closer to home.
We're going to talk about that security, especially when it comes to geopolitics. We're going to come back with Ed Price, Senior Fellow at NYU. You are listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week.
It's 4:40 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. Stocks hit fresh all-time highs. Investors looking ahead to corporate America for further vindication of soft landing bets. Without much in the way of economic data over the next few days, earnings reports are poised to drive Wall Street sentiment. NVIDIA shares gained 2.4%, closing at the highest level on record. The surge came after CEO Jensen Huang said NVIDIA's Blackwell chip is, quote, in full production, and that demand for it is insane. It was a comment that came after Blackwell was delayed because of some engineering snags. NVIDIA's gains helped push the S&P to another record close. It's 46th this year. We bring you the closing numbers each day here at Bloomberg. The S&P gained 45 points, a new high. NASDAQ up 160 points. The Dow gained 201, and the bond markets are closed today. Federal Reserve Governor Christopher Waller said recent economic data signals policymakers can approach subsequent interest rate reductions with less urgency than when they met last month, saying, quote, we can proceed with moving policy toward a neutral stance at a deliberate pace. Waller says the economy is on solid footing with employment near the Fed's objectives and inflation approaching policymakers' 2% target. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Balance of Power, or rather, Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stinovich.
All right, Amy, thank you so much. I want to get right back to Ed Price, former British trade official. He has advised members of the European and British parliaments. Today, he's non-resident senior fellow over at New York University, and he's principal for geopolitical forecasting at the global intelligence and consulting firm Ergo. He is still with us from upstate New York. Hey, listen, you opened the door, mentioned, we talked NATO a little bit, and you know, what it might mean in terms of the U.S. involvement going forward when it comes to the war between Russia and Ukraine. It is amazing to me, Ed, or not surprising, that there was a period where every day one of the top stories on the Bloomberg had to do with the war between those two countries. Obviously, now we have the Middle East we're following, and that is atop the lists of concerns. Geopolitically, though, let's talk about Russia, Ukraine, and where you think this might go and how the U.S. election outcome, you know, might impact that.
Well, thank you, Carol. I mean, it's astonishing and sad that we've been talking to each other now for years about this war, and it's entering its third winter. So I think where it's gone is more or less where the broad analytical community expected it to go, which was stalemate. There are, of course, two caveats to that. One is time, which is that the Russians are fighting a war of attrition. And the other is, for want of a better phrase, bravery, in that the Ukrainians have now thrust into the Kursk region with their own offensive. My interpretation of that offensive is that it is designed as a message, a plea to the United States, saying, look, we can do the job, we have the will, give us the means. And of course, we are still sitting on decisions such as whether or not long-range weaponry should be allowed to be used on Russian soil. So a lot will come down to who's sitting in the White House, I think.
What do you say to U.S. citizens who might be like, well, it's the Europeans' problem? I'm playing devil's advocate here, as you can tell. But say it's for the Europeans to figure out, to support, to provide funding and weapons. What do you say to that?
Well, I would say that Munich in 1938 was the Europeans' problem. And then after that, Poland in 1939 was the Europeans' problem. And then after that, it wasn't. It was ours. It was America's problem. And America has a fundamental core national interest in containing, if not defeating, aggressive military powers in the world. I mean, this is almost one of the top three American things, right? It's like apple pie, the aforementioned freedom, and beating dictators. So, you know, I'm surprised when I hear that narrative. I think it's tied in a strange way to this Trump wing of the Republican Party, if there's another wing left, in which Russia is held up as an example, Hungary is held up as an example of how to do business, how to run a country. It's very strange. But of course, it's patently false. And should Putin defeat Ukraine in the field, we're in a world of trouble.
Meaning what? There'll be Poland or something else next?
Well, first of all, dictatorships everywhere will be emboldened. I think that there's an obvious link between the relationship between Russia and Iran was obviously emboldened to embolden others such as Hezbollah and Hamas to attack Israel. So this is not one war. This war is an ecosystem. but meaning as well that the revanchist nationalist Russia that Putin has unleashed in the last decade or so, and that we have failed to confront, does have its eyes on the restoration of a former Tsarist empire. It's not the Soviet model. This is a red herring. It's the Tsarist imperial model of Russia, in which there are these vassals, these occupied vassals around its borders as a form of self-defense. You can perfectly well imagine why the Russians are paranoid. They've been invaded several times. Believe it or not, British and Japanese troops have been on Russian soil in the 20th century and so on. But unless we, the West, properly confront this aggression, I forecast that it will only get worse.
Okay, so make the case then, if members of the U.S. House and Senate are listening or watching right now, make the case as to why you believe it's essential to support Ukraine.
So there's an idealistic case and there is a practical case. The idealistic case is the one that I just gave you. I would appeal to any elected official in the United States. I would appeal to their heart and I would say, look, America has a unique role in the world. Jefferson let the genie out of the bottle. It's a good genie. It's about human freedom and it should be universal. That's the idealistic case. There's also a monetary case, right? There's a fiscal case, which is how much money do you want to spend putting Putin back in his box? And as far as I'm concerned, this is cynical. You could say, well, who really cares about Ukraine? What we really want is to defeat and degrade Russian power. And by the way, I think we've been doing that. So I think that Putin has made tactical gains measured in years, but has probably set himself back strategically as measured in decades, right? So he's not invincible. The Kursk offensive has shown this. And if we just want to send a rounding error of our national budget and inventory that we otherwise would have mothballed to brave people fighting for freedom, that's an idealistic thing, but it's also very practical because, again, otherwise, you think about Ukraine going down. I mean, then, you know, Poland, the Baltics are in trouble, or Putin says that's enough for now and sends all of his expertise and or materiel soldiers, say, to Iran in a war with Israel. So we really have to think about this practically as well.
Hey, Ed, one thing I wanted to ask you also, coming back from being in the UK and overseas, are people getting frustrated with the U.S. support of Israel?
Yes, but they shouldn't be. This is a very sensitive topic. I recently wrote an op-ed about this. I thought very carefully about writing it, but I did, and it asked 3 questions. One, is Israel fighting a war of self-defense? The answer is yes. The second question was, is Israel conducting a genocide? And the answer is no. And then the third question was, is Israel bringing us all to the brink of World War III? And the answer was, I don't know. If you spend more time thinking about security in terms of appeasement, and 1938, as I mentioned, then Israel was attacked and is doing the absolute right thing in defending itself. If you think this is more like a 1962 Cuban Missile scenario globally, then perhaps we should be getting to the time that we wrap this thing up. I'm in the former camp. A lot of people are in the latter, but I would say that every single time Putin has said, look, I'm going to use terrible weapons, he doesn't always use or ever use the word nuclear weapons. And we've said, well, actually, we will cross that red line. He's done nothing. So I think we are acting with a weak attitude and a strong hand, and we should get on and finish the job.
I'm going to hate myself for asking you this, but 40 seconds quickly. What do you think is the #1 threat to the world, be it an individual, a dictator, or a country? Just quickly.
I think the #1 threat to the world is a all-out conflict between China and the United States that turns nuclear. The good news is I think that's unlikely right now. The Chinese do not want to attack Taiwan before they see how these other 2 conflicts play out. And so there's another, maybe third reason for your senators and your congressmen and congresswomen avoiding World War III.
We did it.
You took us around the world, as you always do. Thank you so much. Glad we can reach out to you and that your hours coincide a little bit better with us right now.
The U.S., Russia, Ukraine, Israel, more of the Middle East, China. We did it all with Ed Price.
Yeah, and as we often say, it's all complicated. Him laying it out, though, so clearly. Ed Price, thank you so much. Senior fellow at NYU, former British trade official. Thank you. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Massar and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, this is Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Massar along with Tim Stenivek live in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio.
It's already being promoted. I see it on the screen.
It's called the tease
It's
for a
tease.
reason.
Okay.
Yeah, give it away. Go.
Well, it's about the media world,
Yeah.
about politics.
Okay.
And
You don't have to be so vague now.
Vice President Kamala Harris has come under criticism for not being as open with the press as her counterpart.
Okay.
And also J.D. Vance, much more, giving many more interviews than
Yeah,
Tim Walz since
out there.
becoming chosen as picked as the vice presidential candidate. Now, Harris, according to the New York Times, is going to be sitting down with Fox News' Brett Baer in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, he's their chief political anchor. It's gonna take place Philadelphia Wednesday, shortly before it airs at 6 p.m. So it sounds like they're gonna sit down, tape it, and then they'll air it, which we've seen that happen with various news outlets. His program, Special Report, Harris is expected to sit for 25 to 30 minutes of questions, according to the network. It is her first formal interview with Fox News. Their day-to-day, we know, certainly has a certain political bent. I don't think I'm revealing anything. But
It does, but as we've learned throughout this year, it also has a very large number of independent viewers. And my question, and I think maybe a lot of people would be asking who are looking at this from the perspective of, what are the candidates doing to try to win, might say, wait a second, why were you not doing this 2 months ago, 3 months ago? Why were you not on Fox News at every chance you could get to try to reach those independent voters?
yeah, I don't know. It's interesting.
Pete Buttigieg has been known to spend a lot of time on Fox News.
Has for a long time,
Yeah,
right?
for a
He's
long
been
time.
pretty comfortable doing it. I guess the one thing I will say, and I'm really not being political here. I mean, she just became the candidate in July. Had a convention to do. There's been a lot. Having said that, I do think it's important. I think many Americans would say it's important for these candidates to get out and about and talk to American citizens, right? And in different media environments, right, where you might get a different line of questioning. And she certainly will here.
Yeah, I think the big
One would
question is where does Joe Rogan fit into this? Because Donald Trump has been giving a hint that he'll sit down with Joe Rogan ahead of this election. He hasn't done that yet. We're 3 weeks away. He's offering some sort of indication that will happen. Would that be a good place for Kamala Harris if she were invited on that podcast to go? Probably. It reaches a lot of people.
Yeah, I would say so. And especially if you think about how people get news nowadays, we talk about it all the time. It's not necessarily your traditional outlets. It's, social media apps. It's Instagram. It's TikTok. It's Facebook. It's a lot of different outlets. And so you kind of got to meet voters where they get their news and information. And so I would say yes, yes, and yes. Right? I don't know, if you were advising a political candidate, right? I would say, yeah, you got to look at these different platforms. That's how it is.
I would throw everything against the wall.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think also, polling has indicated that at least in the early part of the Harris portion of the campaign, voters were still getting to know Harris and Walz especially. Many people were unfamiliar with him when he was chosen as the vice president nominee.
Yeah, he's actually been interviewed on Fox News Sunday the past 2 weekends. So apparently his aides reached out to Fox to schedule his second appearance. So he has definitely been out there. And the network has also welcomed a string of Harris supporters, including Governor Gavin Newsom of California, Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, and as you said, Pete Buttigieg, who is pretty much a regular at this point. He's been going on for a while.
On Monday, according to the New York Times, Kamala Harris used interviews with Roland Martin and The Shade Room, an online entertainment publication, to further her pitch to black voters, arguing that Mr. Trump had engaged in a decades-long pattern of racist behavior. She's set to do a live interview in Detroit with Charlemagne the God, host of The Breakfast Club, particularly popular with black millennials. A lot of reporting in the last couple of days about how she's reaching out to the black community right now. This, according to the New York Times.
And to be fair, Donald Trump, frequent presence on Fox News. Also, though, we should point out that tomorrow he will be interviewed by the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg News, John Micklethwaite, at the Economic Club of Chicago. So we will certainly be hearing from him and that conversation.
That starts at noon New York time.
I think different outlets are good, whether it caters to young women, to young men, to to the Latin American population, to the Black population, because I think it's safe to say we are a very diverse electorate and diverse citizen base, and we all have different needs. There is some commonality in terms of being able to put a house over your family's head and feed them and so on and so forth, get a job, support yourself. But there are different nuances, right? Because we know it's not all equal.
And early voting in some places kicking off too very soon.
Yeah, exactly, right? So I think it'll be interesting. I'll certainly be watching. It's been fun to see, some of them on the evening and late night talk shows, and that's certainly a different format. So we'll see how this goes down. Yeah.
Tomorrow,
Yeah.
noon, Wall Street time. Our editor-in-chief, John Micklethwaite, interviewing former President Trump live from Chicago. We'll be bringing that to you live everywhere.
Yeah, and I think it's just interesting coming off of our conversation with Ed Price, who, as he said, traveled around the country, went west, came back, went a northern route, then came back the southern route across the United States, and what he saw, and I think saying that it's kind of difficult to call to some extent, right?
Yeah, it is.
Although he did talk about some momentum, he felt like, in terms of signage and other
Yeah,
things.
and I've talked about this before. I didn't have time to bring it up with Ed Price, but over the summer when I was in Western New York, a very conservative area that historically has had many, many Trump signs, it didn't seem like the enthusiasm was the same that it had been in recent years. That was back in August.
Yeah, right?
Still
It's a
signs,
little bit different.
not as many.
Most read story in the past 8 hours, stocks rise as earnings set to kick into high gear. So, folks, get ready. We've got some earnings momentum in a big way, certainly coming your way this week, as well as a lot of political conversations. If you missed anything, be sure to check out our podcast. You can find it at Bloomberg.com or wherever you get your podcast feeds. For Tim Stenovic, I'm Carol Masser. Balance of Power starts right now.